So next Thursday, yeah. The following Thursday, not.
You ready?
I am, yeah. You? And also you'll send it there, right? Huh?
Yeah.
Go? It's live? It's live? Okay, good morning. So in the continuation of our Seder Ishtalshalis course, we can call it that, after covering all the higher levels before Atzilus, all the way lifting at Tzimtzum, we discussed Atzilus, different aspects of it. And last week I concluded talking about the spheres, in general, the spheres. And so the next step, of course, is to go into the actual spheres themselves. What are they? And just as I was doing with the Elamus and all these levels, explaining not just what a summary of what Chassidus says about it, but also why is it negaya? Nothing is levatola chas v'shalom, especially not say the shtalshlus. So everything has a purpose. If there's a level, that means it's negaya to the big plan. And as I've been explaining, it's negaya in two levels. First, for us to understand, the Eibishter wants us to understand as much as possible the process of how he creates. He doesn't want it to be just Kabbalah sale. It's part of Da'asa L'kei Avicham v'yedai Tayim. Yediyah, like Alter Rebbe says in the Geras HaKedesh, Yediyah Seishtalshlus is a mitzvah Rama v'gdela me'ed. To understand the way the Eibishter put things into place, it's part of the mitzvah of understanding the Eibishter himself. And the second aspect of it is also giving us the tools in Avodas Hashem to use these madregas, to climb, so to speak, the ladder in our being misachid, our uniting ourselves, miskasher, the dovka by his baruch, to connect to the Eibishter. And it's really Haba Hatalia, because by the Eibishter creating so-called these stepping stones of how he created existence from the highest levels all the way Ma'ila Ma'ila Adin Kates, all the way Lamata Mata Adin Tachlis, from the highest Meresh Kol Dargan, Atsev Kol Dargan. He's also giving us the tools to retrace the steps and climb Lamata Ma'ila from the lowest back up, literally to the highest levels. And in simple terms, when you say L'dofka by his baruch, or you say V'alachta b'drachav, now this is halacha words. These are words from the Torah, and halacha is not just in nigla, not just in Chassidus. It means to be medam ourselves, like mahu chanun af atachanun, mahu rachum af atarachum. That we're being medabik, we're being connecting ourselves to the midas of the Eibishter by emulating these midas. So l'cha Hashem hagdula hagvura v'tiferes v'netzach v'heid. So we are emulating, when we do chesed, we're essentially emulating and copying and mirroring the Eibishter's chesed. The same thing with Gvura, same thing with Av and Yira, same thing with Tiferes. Same thing obviously with Chabad when we learn Teres, Kol HaKeira v'Teira, Kodesh Baruch Hu Keira v'Sheni Kenegdei. So there's the connection that we make through all these levels in the Ishtalshalis, both in the Elamus and the Spheres. So as I said, I'll be explaining not just what the Dargah entails, but also why is it negaya to the picture of Achdus Hashem, and also negate to our Avodas Hashem. So with that, I began briefly, but I'll just start from the beginning again. So we talk about the spheres. Spheres, there we know Eser, V'lei Echad Oser, Eser V'lei Teisha. There's 10, not 11, not 9. So last week I explained what about Keser. How do you deal with Keser? Seems to be an 11th sphere. Spheres are Keser. So that we covered, that Keser and Das are interchangeable, so you always have 10. Either one is counted or one is not counted based on Primius or Chitzenius or Spheres. Das and is counted when it's Primius, and Arich, Chitzenius or Keser is counted when it's Chitzenius. Atik therefore is never counted. So, I mean, Chassidus still has the struggles understanding what that means exactly, but I don't want to go into the details of that so much, not so negate to Yonenu. So from there, we move from Keser to Chochma. So basically, this share is going to be about Keser and Chochma, and remember, besides the fact that each sphere has its own personality and its own identity, its own siyur, kema, it also has a relationship with other spheres. In other words, every sphere comes from the one before it. Chochma comes from Keser, and Bina will come from Chochma, and so on. Das, and the same with the spheres afterwards. So we have to understand not just the sphere, also its relationship. Especially when it comes to Keser and Chochma, that is critical. You'll see in Chassidus, it's always connecting the two. Even though there's definitely Maimorim that talk about Chochma without mentioning Keser, but whenever you hear about Chochma, the Vishtalshus HaChochma, where Chochma comes from, always refer to Chochma Ma'ayin Timotza, the Ayin. So even though the Pasuk simply means Chochma Favant Kum Chochma, but the Chassidus touched it not as a question, but as a statement. Chochma comes from Ayin. It's Timotza, it's Mitzias. It's a nimtza from Ayin, which is the level of Keser. In other words, Chochma L'gabe Keser is like Yesh L'gabe Ayin, Fierach. So let's explain what this means. So thank God, as I said, Chassidus Chabad is Mepsari Erzel Leka, means from our flesh, from our very Keiches HaNefesh, and from even our very bodies, we can understand godliness. And that's what the Alter Rebbe did. He gave B'Shalom Gashmi physical examples from this world, and especially from a human being who was created B'Tselem Elokim. So the Pasuk is giving us directly, Tselem Elokim. You want to have a good understanding of Elokim, of the Tselem of Elokim, which means how Elokus is mislabish in Tselem and Mus. Kemuva, not Elokus Misaratzme, the way it's mislabish in the Esesphiris, we call Odom Elyon. So we look at the Tselem, the Odom, which is created with Tselem Elokim. So where do we see Keser and Chochma in our life? So Chochma, as Chassidus explains, starting from Tanya right in the beginning, Perek Gimel, which says Chochma is the Nekuda of Barak HaMavrik. It's the first flash of an idea. Everyone knows that when the cognitive process of any thinking, of any concept, always begins not with a big arichas, an idea. It's a flash. As a matter of fact, there are researchers today that tell you that we have thousands of such flashes every minute, but we don't remember them. It's the only ones that we remember are the ones that become an idea that it develops. So we can have these flashes all the time, and they're so quick and they're so fleeting that they just disappear, just like a spark. And the question whether it's like thousands or whatever the number is, but it makes total sense. And another thing, sometimes you have ideas, you don't even remember the idea. Sometimes you think of something, say, I had an idea, and then you forget it. Why? Because the yesod of Chochma is that it's just a spark. And it's literally compared to both. You'll see even in examples they use a flash, a light bulb, a flash. I had a flash of an idea. So what does that mean exactly? So if you think about it, a spark literally means it comes from somewhere. If you see a spark, it means somewhere there's a fire, and the fire is shooting off sparks. Even if you don't see the fire, you only see the spark. You know it's coming from somewhere, and that's exactly how it works with Chochma. So we'll call Chochma the first step of conscious cognitive, of the cognitive. It's the first step of consciousness where we're aware of an idea. But that's not necessarily the beginning of where Seichel starts from. So the question is, where did this spark come from? And this is the answer, that it comes from Ayin. It comes from a place we don't know. We can't identify it. We just know it came from somewhere. In the language of Maimorim, it came from somewhere, but where it came from, we can't identify. Even in today's secular psychology, it's as common, this is a fact. Everyone, they either call it collective unconscious or the subconscious. I like to use the word supraconscious because and it sounds like below, like a sub, like a basement. Supraconscious is above conscious. So basically, it would look like this, if we can give a mushal. Just a mushal is my own example. If you see, let's say, water dripping from a faucet, right? In your kitchen or in your sink, you turn on the water comes down as a small flow. We all know that flow is not where it begins. It's not like there's water in the faucet. The faucet is just a receptacle, it's just a channel that is guiding the water that's coming from the pipes beneath the sink, which if you follow those pipes will lead you to main pipes in your house, which will lead you all the way to the main pipe, the main line in the middle of the street, the main water line that connects what? These are arteries that connect all the way to ultimately to reservoirs that can be hundreds of miles away. Most of the water, for example, in New York, comes from reservoirs upstate New York that travel literally hundreds of miles. These are reservoirs that are like major, more than pools, they're like major lakes, man-made pools that collect water from the rain, melting snow and so on, and then they mix it with chlorine and other things to purify it. And that water runs through big arteries, and that water is what feeds New York City. Same thing as in other places. In our case in New York is a place where there's water, natural water. In places like California or Arizona where there's desert, it's a big chiddush to get water there because there's no natural water. It doesn't rain most of the year. So there they have to figure out all kinds of methods how they do it. But the point I want to make is that when you see a drop of water coming from a faucet, it's connected to an artery that you don't see, that all the way back to a reservoir, that ultimately is the place where it's all there. So literally you could say the same thing with ideas. Where do ideas come from? An idea that flows into your mind, the first spark of an idea, didn't come from nowhere. It comes from a place where the language of Chassidus is koyach hamaskil. In the language of Kabbalah, it's called chochmas dema. And that's the level of arich, or the level of atik as well, also has chochma. Chochmas dema, we'll talk about it more later, the two levels of chochmas dema and atik and arich. But bottom line is, what's chochmas dema is the hidden chochma. Chochma, the Atzilus that we know of, is chochma gluya. That's the contrast. One is hidden, one is revealed. The only thing is, the big key difference is, with the mashal that I gave, is that's not daimel and nimshal, is the mashal, the water in the reservoir is exactly the same water in the sink. It's just a small flow. It's only a change in kamus, in quantity. There's no change in quality. Whereas with Keser and Chochma Tema, even if you're able to trace the idea, you're not going to find a reservoir of ideas. In other words, even if you're able to take an X-ray of the brain or figure out where ideas come from, you're not going to find a place where there are billions of ideas and one of them trickles down into the faucet called Chochma. So that's a big difference. That is an Eichosdik difference as well. I'll discuss that now more at length, what that means. But first, just establishing that seichel. So seichel, based on this principle, is actually turns around in a way that is quite fascinating. Because most people think intelligence is a powerful thing, and when you're a smart person, you're a chacham, you have chachman and bina and das and so on, you have it all figured out. From this, basically, it comes opposite. Actually, chacham is only one little nekuda of real seichel. So in other words, real seichel is really where all the ideas are. The fact that we get one idea is only one tipa b'yam. That's exactly the word used, tipa b'yam. It's like one drop in an ocean. So actually, the real seichel, we don't even have access to real seichel. To put it in different words, and I'll use a little psychological terminology. They talk about, for example, God forbid, a person suffers, let's say, trauma or a shock or a death, or something that shakes up the whole system. Now, when a person is in a state like that, they are very difficult it's very difficult for the person to function. So the fact of the matter is, so Pitera, there's this time of Shleisha and Shiva and Shleishim, and then there's after Yud Beis Chedesh, it says, Mishtachik Libe, person starts forgetting. But imagine if a person didn't forget terrible event, they would never be able to function. So the brain has what's called in neurology, chemicals. The brain has a way of compartmentalizing. This is essentially figuring out that when a person experiences something, after a while it becomes like stored in the mind, and you could always remember that it happened, you could retrieve it, but it doesn't have quite the intensity as it was then. When people who suffer from paranoia or depression, ongoing, and they can't forget terrible things, no matter how much time passes, is because their chemicals are not working properly. In other words, think of the faucet example. Imagine a faucet was broken, and the water keeps running all the time, and you can't control it, you can't regulate it. It'll flood. So basically, the idea of consciousness, which starts with Chochmah, besides that it brings a trickle, it's also controlling that you just shouldn't have a flow of endless ideas. As a matter of fact, there's a statement, you're going to have to climb under. There's actually a statement where they say that there's a very thin line between genius and madness. That some people who are geniuses, they're just one step away from being mad, from losing it. Why is that the case? Genius and madness are two extremes. Because a genius is essentially a person whose channels are broader, open from Chochmas Tema or from Koyach HaMaskil, the channels are wider and broader. And therefore, you're a very noisy guy. The channels are wider and broader. And therefore, more ideas flow. Essentially, basically, their conscious mind is more connected to the superconscious. That's what a ilui is. If you want to technically define a ilui. I know we don't usually technically define it, but that's what's going on. The channels are wider. But what happens if the channels get a little too wide? Then the ideas come flowing and a person can't even control themselves. That's why you sometimes see an ilui, a prodigy, a genius, that speaks and nobody can understand what they're saying. They don't know how to control themselves. They have no koyach ha'agbola. Because what's happening is the ideas are flowing. Even the Rebbe, we talk about it was the Magid or the Mitler Rebbe say shah still. That when the Nevi'as HaMeichen was so heavy, he would have to say shah, quiet down the mind. Because when the open channel between the superconscious and the conscious, or we're calling Chochmas Tema or Koyach HaMaskil, it's just another word for Chochmas Tema, even though there are differences, but B'chlos, it's the power of where Seichel comes from. And Chochma, the actual idea, the channel is, if it's open too much, we would go mad. There's no way. Just think for a moment. Imagine an idea started flowing in your mind right now without stopping. You couldn't stop it. You'd go crazy from it. It would just be too much. It would make you crazy, and then definitely anyone around you. So it's interesting, therefore, that insanity actually is closer to reality than sanity. Because if you go into that Koyach HaMaskil, there's unlimited ideas. So actually, Bli Gvul is more natural and more real than Gvul. But we can never exist in a world of Bli Gvul, because Bli Gvul would be too much for us. So essentially, the journey from Keser to Chochma is really like a journey. I don't want to call it Bli Gvul Mamish, because it's not Bli Gvul Mamish Kipshute, but Lefi Erech, the one idea of Chochma, the collective ideas, the many ideas of Koyach HaMaskil or Chochmas Tema, what we're calling the superconscious, is like Bli Gvul. And if it would flow without a regulator, which in neurology is called chemicals, we would not be able to function. On the other hand, if it's too much b'tzimtzum, think of a faucet that's broken the other way around, that no water is coming out, or it's just a very narrow trickle. That's also not good enough. That would be a person whose ideas come slowly and not that easy, and the mind is somewhat blocked. There's a block going on between Keser and Chochma. So the key really is to have a balance between the two, that it's wide enough that the channel is open, that Keser feeds into Chochma, but it's not too wide to drive us crazy. On the other hand, it's not too narrow, so you have at least ideas flowing. And the difference between intelligence, I'm talking about a Chochma now, I'm not talking about Bina and Das now, a Maven or a Bardas. I'm talking about purely people who come up with ideas, geniuses that come up with unbelievable ideas, and you say, where did they get this idea from? Why did Einstein come up with this idea and someone else didn't? Or the Ragachover had certain ideas, or other Iluyim and Ge'inim have certain innovations, and you hear them, you say, wow, that's amazing. What did they have that others didn't have? We say, yes, but they had a better mind. True, that's true. The mind is able to bless them with a better mind. But even more so, more practically or more technically, you can say, is that the channel between that Bli Gvul, so-called source of Seichel, Koyach HaMaskil, and the Seichel is wider and more open. Is it possible that the Koyach HaMaskil is also on a higher level? You could say that too. Just like you have some people who are born stronger, physically stronger, other people born weaker. You could also have people who have stronger minds and weaker minds. But don't underestimate that it could also be as a result of the channel, which explains that a Chagav, even though it's Negeya somewhat, why you see the concept of Yegaita Mitzasi. In Samach Vov especially explains that through Yegiya, a lesser mind can come to a deeper understanding than without Yegiya. And you see this all the time. You see people, I remember our class, and I remember, you see it all the time, people have very good minds. They grasp and they take for something very quickly. but they're lazy minds, and they don't harava. So they will grasp faster than another student, but they won't have it so gruntig. They'll make mistakes because they didn't harava with it. You see another person who may not have such a powerful brain power, so to speak. The firepower is not there, but there's yagiyah. And the yagiyah of that person, by the effort and working hard, what does Chassidus say? It opens up the channel. That's what yagiyah does. As a matter of fact, in Samach Vov in in the early Maimorim there, he talks about the difference between the Helam Sheyeshnu b'Metzias and the Helam She'enu b'Metzias. You learned this, that Maimor? Difference between with yagiyah and not yagiyah. So he gives the example of the Tzur HaChalomish compared to the Shalheves Kshura B'Gachelas. Tzur HaChalomish is a flintstone. So Tzur HaChalomish, it means it's a stone that has in it the power to give off fire, but you have to strike it. A flintstone is a regular stone. You can't see any sparks in it. But when you hit it hard, either against another stone or whatever, sparks can come out of it. On the other hand, a shalheves kshura b'gachelas, a white coal, a hot white coal. So when you look at it, it may not look like it's burning. But if you fan it, you see there's fire. And if you put it in water, it'll be extinguished. The stone, you can put in water and it does not diminish its power to give off sparks. So the Rebbe Rashab explains, because one is a helam sheyesh b'mitzias. In the white coal, it's a helam. The fire is behelam, but it's a mitzias. It's just, we don't see it. So that you fan, it doesn't take a lot of effort. And the fire emerges. The tzur chalamis is only through yagiyah. When you strike it, then sparks fly. And that is the example that the yagiyah reaches deeper into the koyach hamaskil and is able to draw more seichel than someone without yagiyah. So the smart person, by beteva, beteldose, is smarter with purely the brain, but the yagiyah opens up the channels between Keser and Chochma. Now, of course, a natural smart person with yagiyah, of course, is going to have both milas, obviously. But I was just using it as comparative purposes. So that explains, at least Bekitzer, what is the role of how Keser and Chochma work in the world of Seichel. Now, another point that's critical to mention here, and then I'm going to go and discuss it more in context of Elokus, because what we're talking now is more like Keiches HaNefesh, Seichel, where Seichel comes from. But remember, Keser and Chochma are also Spheres Kadeshas, they're the Eibishter Spheres. So they express different levels of Elokus. So I'll talk about that, because I wanted to go Mipsari Erza Lekaf, first understand how it makes sense to us. Because now we have a perfect example. You could think about how your ideas flow into your mind. It's flowing from the Keser in your Nefesh. That's exactly how Seichel works. Now, from Chochma to Bina we'll discuss next. Not discussing how from that Nekuda then becomes a Spashtus to Bina. But so we're still discussing Chochma and Keser. The second most important thing to remember here is this. This, when you understand Seichel like this, besides what I said before, point number one, that the truth is that the smartest person is only a tipa min hayam from the real koyach hamaskil, whereas real Seichel is. Even as wise as a person's chochma may be, it's only one drop compared to that koyach hamaskil. So that alone is a union of bittul. When you realize as smart as you are, you're just one drop. There's another thing that's important here. And this is a very important point, especially nowadays, especially in the last few centuries. Seichel has become for many almost like God. People worship Seichel. To the point that when the Enlightenment, the Maskilim and the general Enlightenment they came, they said, once you have science, you don't need God. Once we could understand and explain things, that's all we need. We're Bari Seichel. What do we need to have Amunah and so on? And they have all kinds of explanations in that. Everything can be explained. The thing is like this. When we look at Seichel, we think Seichel, most people think Seichel is the most superior quality that a human being can have. Why? Because human beings are much weaker than animals, but with our Seichel, we're able to, Hu Yimshal, we're able to be Meishal and Shelet B'chol Elam Kulei. Like it says in Chumash, Purur Vuvik Sa'aretz. Why? Because of our Seichel. So our ingenuity is able to subdue even animals that are far more powerful than we are. We're also able to harness energy able to travel to outer space. So when you look at Seichel, what Seichel has accomplished, it could be a big nisayon that a person should think, look how powerful, look what we've done. Look at what medicine, accomplishments in medicine and technology and other science that changed the world. And no one's arguing that. That's not the case. We have done that. We've changed the life. Life expectancy today is double what it was 100 years ago. People lived in their 40s in 1920s, was the average. And today they live in their 80s. So there's a real shinui in the elam that came from human intelligence and human inquiry and human research, etc., etc. However, here's the key nekuda here. Based on that, seichel seems to be the most superior quality we have. But here's what Chassidus explains. Seichel is sachakol, another gili of elikus. It has no power of its own. The Eibishter wanted us to have seichel. So he gave us a part of his seichel, and that's where it comes from. The true nature of seichel is not to understand things, and this is the key, but to recognize the emes of something. The difference between the two statements I just said, one does not need bittul. To understand things, you don't need bittul necessarily. You can have a yesh gomur mamish that understands things well. Adrab, the more he understands, the more of a yesh he is. He needs bittul because by nature, chochma is bittul because you need to put yourself and your interests aside to understand the idea, not to be sheikhid ya'avareni chachamim and bias. So seichel by nature requires putting aside all your taivas or other things to be able to understand an idea. But be'etzem, you can have seichel and be a yesh gomer. On the contrary, some people, the biggest yesh are people with the smartest people, and they feel that they are the superior. However, what Chassidus explains, and I'll soon explain in Keser and Chochma language, is that seichel is really a tool that the Eibishter gave us to recognize emes that's greater than we are. In other words, to put it in simple English, if we were just bali midas, like animals, so even though it says animals also have das hanikne or seichel hanikne, which means you see animals have certain intelligence, they're smart in how they hunt, they have strategy, they know how to catch their prey, so they're not purely midas, but they're driven by midas. An animal that is hungry, you can't reason with an animal that's hungry, because their whole inyan is like it says about the kolov, like a kelev, a dog, kulei lev. It's all emotion. However, the Eibishter also gave them seichel to figure out how to satisfy their emotions. If we were purely bali midas, we would not have the ability to control me'ech shalt al lev. If you're hungry, you're hungry. If you're thirsty, you're thirsty. There's no inyan of, you can't expect, for example, a lion to fast on Yom Kippur, because a lion can't fast the whole day. It's impossible. A human being has the power, even though you're hungry, to say, I'm not going to feed my hunger right now. Or the same thing, you could feel that you want to get angry, or other emotions. If we were pure emotions, everything would be driven, as the Alter Rebbe says in Pedic Tes, by the lev, which is an impulsive heart. Impulses would drive our lives. And seichel would be used to satisfy your impulses. The fact that we have independent intelligence means that we can understand something objectively. You may have something I want, and I'm not just going to grab it. We can reason with each other. Now, you could say most human beings don't necessarily reason. If they want something, it's aniva afsiyeh. It's true, because they're giving in to their midas. But that doesn't mean they cannot. A human being is capable of using their seichel. So seichel really introduces, we'll call it objectivity, an objective truth that is beyond ourselves. So when we say, for example, the Friedrich Rebbe has an expression, an animal never saw the sky, because animals walk on all four, and their eyes face down to the ground. I know whenever I say this, people start telling me, what about a giraffe or an ape? They walk upright sometimes. But even they also look down. They just have a long neck, a giraffe. What means they look down? It means they don't look into heaven. There's no concept to look and be curious about what's going on above them. Why? Because they don't need to. Their physiological nature, meaning their physical nature, is aligned with their personality, which is to survive, to breed and have children, to hunt and feed, and to bring up the next generation. That's what a cow does all day. That's why you see animals don't look to improve their lives. They don't look for better automobiles or better cell phones or in general technology. Why? Because that's not their role. By human being, we walk upright. It's not just physical. It's because spiritually, the neshama is Neir Hashem Nishmas Adam. Like a Neir, it looks upward. We are curious. This is due to the mind going beyond your own self-interest, which is why human beings can go beyond their subjectivity, their negias. So even though Adam Karavetz Latzmei and there's Avas Atzmei and all that comes in Negei B'Davar, but we have the capacity to rise above it. Yes, it takes work, but we have the capacity. An animal doesn't even have B'Chelis to do that, because we have Seichel. So Seichel is more than just understanding things. Seichel is understanding an emes that's greater than you. That even though it may not be in your interest, your Seichel can tell you there's an Eibishter in the world and you should be Mushubit to the Eibishter. If you went purely by Midas, you'd say, I want to do what I want. I want to do what I want. Called Adam, whatever, called Alim Gvar. Everybody wants to do whatever they want. But your Seichel tells you, 1 second, there's a truth and a reality greater than me. So the nature, therefore, so when you think of now Chochma and Keser, that Chochma is coming from Keser, it tells you exactly that point. That Seichel is not an Inyan La'atzmi. The very concept of consciousness is coming from a reality that's greater than us. That's ayin, which we can't see, but we know it's coming from there. So it's telling us that really the whole point of Seichel is to understand an emes that's greater than we are. In other words, if we didn't have Seichel, we could never connect to the Eibishter beyond our needs. The only way we'd be able to connect is like animals connect. They also say Shira. We could thank the Eibishter for giving us food, Hazana Sakel, for giving us life, for giving us health, for giving us a family. But could you connect to the Eibishter beyond your needs? No, because you have nothing to work with. Everything's about you. The fact that we have Seichel allows us to understand the Eibishter on the Eibishter's terms. And that's why, and this is a key thing, that if you look in Tanya now, Perek Lamed Hey, in the Hagah, it's the only place where the Alter Rebbe quotes the Magid. He says, Shemaiti Memeri. I'll talk about that in a moment. Shemaiti Memeri, that Chochma is the level that's Margish, Hu Levade Ve'ein Zulose. Chochma is Margish, what? That the Eibishter alone, Ve'ein Zulose, and nothing else. But Chochma is Seichel. Is Bina not Margish that? No. Because Chochma, because of its bittul, and because that's why it's only a spark. It's not yet I understand something. Chochma is receiving Seichel from a place called Kei Hamaska or Chochma Stima. So but Etzem Uhusei, it's bottled because it senses all the time that Hu Levade Ve'ein Zulose. He doesn't say that Chochma is just Seichel is just smart. It's understanding a higher emes, I remember hearing from some Mashpiyim saying the difference between Chochma and Bina, which we'll talk about more when we talk about Bina, that in Bina, the person says, Ich verstehe, I understand. And Chochma says that Inyan is verstandig. The Inyan is understood. In other words, with Bina, the focus is I understand. There's a person. And the Chochma, the Inyan is verstandig. Another way of putting it, the Bina, the Mensch versteht the Inyan. The Mensch nimmt the Inyan, and Chochma, the Inyan nimmt the Mensch. See the difference? In Bina, I am integrating the idea, which is necessary in step 2. And Chochma, the idea is integrating me. It's more important. When you're learning Torah, it's not just I understand what it says, it's the Torah is including me into its reality. So essentially, Keser is the emes of Elokus, and that is allowing itself to translate into a very limited way, because it's only a Nekudas HaChochma. And that is why Chochma is called, that's why Chochma is Hu Levade Ve'ein Zulose. Which also explains what you always hear about Chochma having 2 levels in it. Chochma is made up of the 2 words, Koyach Ma. The Chassidus explains, Koyach of Chochma is the Koyach HaChochma, the Seichel of it, and Ma is the bitl of it. So there is going to be parts in Chochma, because remember, Chochma has to carry this emes of Ma and Ayin to Matzah into Bina and into lower spheres. Because Chochma, as we shall discuss, also is the Reishis Kol HaSpheres. But, so basically you could look at Chochma as 2 sides to Chochma. Think of Chochma as like a Talmud, Lefnei HaRav, Lefnei Keser, so Chochma is being Mekabel from Keser, then it's Ma. That's why it has to have that element of Bittul. When Chochma is turning to its Talmud, so the Talmud now is becoming a Rav to lower levels, Chochma Bina, which is essentially the idea of teaching Bina, Chakim Bebina, as the expression goes. So then you have the idea where Chochma is being nimshar downward. But we're still focusing now Chochma as it looks up to Keser. If just to add a little, if you learned in Ayin Beis it's in Chelek Aleph in the early volumes, I don't know where it is now. So he talks about Chochma as Aleph. Aleph refers to Chochma because the first of the spheres. But he says Aleph is also Esis Pella. And he brings from a Zayar where he says that there's two days. Is Aleph Chochma, Pella is Keser. Pella is Keser and Chochma is Aleph. So one day in Zayar says that Aleph is Esis Pella. That means it's a keli for Pella. Like we're speaking here, Seichel being a keli for the Elikus of the wonder of Elikus, the grandeur you can say of Elikus, that's L'mayla Meseichel. But there's a second day in Zayar that says that Pella and Aleph is Pella. It's exactly the same thing, where it explains that Chochma becomes one with Keser. So you just see from this, and other places in Chassidus, that there's a lot of discussion of how Chochma and Keser meet, because at the end of the day, going now into line of Kamina and Aveda and so on, and Elikus, basically Chochma and Keser are the interface between existence and higher than existence. Because Chochma is the first place we're conscious of something. The human being is conscious. Keser is higher than our consciousness, but it's not completely higher, because Keser is still a state. It's Chochma Stima or Koyach HaMaskil. So many ways, these two dargas are critical, because when you're talking about interfacing, a mamutza, between Elikus and Welt, you could say, but Zoyer Ampin, or in microcosm, that's Chochma Bina. Chochma representing the beginning of Ishtalshlus, and Keser representing the Tachtena Shebemaitzel, which is higher than Ishtalshlus. Even though in Keser itself there's two dargas, but I'm not going to discuss that right now. We'll talk about that more after I finish this sugya here with Chochma. So Koyach Ma is the two aspects of Chochma. One is the bitl of Chochma, Ma, and Koyach is the Seichel Shebechachma. So what do we come away from this? That Seichel is really just a tool for us to experience the emes of Elikus. Getting beyond our subjectivity and our self-interest and experiencing something beyond ourselves. Without Chochma, we would not be able to do that. Now, if you only had Keser and you just jump straight to Bina, you'd be missing our experience here. We want in our Seichel, in our experience, we want to have an element of Bittul. Not just that there's Bittul, Ma'il, Mishtalshlus. Having Keser without Chochma would be like saying having Amunah without Seichel. So it has a big Ma'ila. But you want the Amunah to also be Nimshach in the Seichel. So the Pella of Keser enters now, so-called the Amunah of Keser, or that which is higher than Seichel, or at least higher than Seichel Golei, Gluya, Seichel Golei, Chochma Gluya, enters now into the world of Chochma, and then from there it will be Nimshach already into the other spheres, which we'll talk about. This also explains why in the Esis of Shem Havaya, what Eis is Chochma? Yud. Yud Kei Vav Kei, so the Yud is Chochma, the Hey Rishen is Bina, the Vav is Zah, Midas, and the Hey Achrein is Malchus. That's generally how it's explained. In the Elamis, Atzilus B'ri Yitzir Asi is like the same thing, where Atzilus is the Yud, and B'ri is the Hey, and Yitzir is like the Zah, and Asi is the last Hey. That expression you hear from Tikkun Zeir, that Abba Mekana No B'Atzilus, right? Abba is nests in Atzilus. Bina Mekana B'Kursaya, Ima Mekana B'Kursaya. Bina nests Mekana from the word kan, like a nest. Nests in Kursaya, the world Elam Akise, which is Bria. It says Zah is Mekana No B'Yitzira, and Malchus is Mekana No B'Asiya. So essentially, the four worlds, like in each, the Yud Kei Vav Kei are both in the four elements, but specifically it's Chochma, Bina, Zah, and Malchus. Now, why is it a Yud? Well, it's very understand it, because the Yud is the symbol of Bittul. A Hey is already a Spashtus. A Vav is Amshacha. The Hey, the last Hey, is Makabel. But the Kudus HaYud is the Chochma. And you see, when you break down Chochma itself, just like a Yud is not just a dot. There's also a Tag L'mayla and a Tag L'mata, Keitze L'mayla, Keitze L'mata, because there's how Chochma turns and faces Keser. there's the actual middle of the Yud, the actual dot is Chochma itself, and the Keser Tachten is the bottom point is how Chochma faces Bina. That's how Chassidus explains it. So, but in general, it's Eis Yud, which is the symbol of Bittul, because that's what Chochma is. It's Seichel, but it's a Seichel that doesn't have yet any substance, any breath, any Eirech and Rechev, which is what letter Yud is. The Eirech and Rechev will come in Bina, but the Nekuda is in Chochma, Bittul of Chochma. So, let me see if there's anything more to add to this. So Chochma, therefore Chochma and Keser. Yeah, I want to talk about the two levels, but if anybody has any question, I saw somebody wanted to raise their hand before. Maybe I answered. If you have a question, I'm happy to ask. By the way,
you said about this bittul. Goyim also have this bittul? They also have the bittul of Chochma?
Goyim?
Yeah, because they also have seichel.
Is it negate to this sugya, or you're talking about a different sugya now? Huh?
You're saying about animals, so I thought you explain also have it.
Why don't you ask a question? Do the Goyim have Chochma? Or they only have Bina? There are many Goyim that have very powerful Chochma, have come up with great ideas. So if they have Chochma, you have to say they have some measure of Bittul. Pasha the Metzias is so. The Alter Rebbe writes in Teire that there were Chachmei Umas Elam who were Gewaldike Beidedus, and they were Gewaldike Chachamim. And therefore, you have to say they had a measure of bittul like that. But it's a different discussion when you start talking about difference between Jews and non-Jews. It's not the sugi we're discussing. But if you're asking that question, it's just like asking that they have chachma, and they definitely have chachma. Remember, it says B'Tselem Elikim, Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem, goes on all people, Jews and non-Jews. So keep that in mind as well. So now, so Chochma, Keser. So I want to talk about one more point, which is two levels in Chochma Stima. Because remember, since the spell, I'll spell it out even more. Meinaf Kamina, like I just explained, what would be if we didn't have Chochma, we didn't have Keser? So you wouldn't have this connection. But the whole point is that we human beings should be able to get beyond our own, as I said, subjective, personal nature, and become, through bittul, in this case bittul of Chochma, to be open to something that's beyond us and greater than us. A human being on their own would do whatever they want. You learn Torah, you learn bittul and Kabbalah Seil. You don't do whatever you want. Do what the Eibishter wants you to do. The question is, how high does that go? So Chassidus explains that Chochma Stima itself has two levels. And in Ayin Beis, this is a big arichas, Gdela, where he actually asks a question. So I'll put it in the context of a question, it'll be easier to understand. He says that there's the machlekes I mentioned in the last class, whether Keser is Ein Sof or not. So the Arizal is metavich by saying there's two levels in Keser. Atik is Ein Sof. Atik is Tachtena Sheba Maitzel, represents the Maitzel, the emanation, the emanator. And what means Tachtena? Not physically the lowest level. It means the most outer level of Elikus as it begins to relate to the next levels. And Arich is Reisha Netzolim, is the beginning of the Netzolim, like we just explained. It's the beginning of Chochmah. However, it's still in the form of Chochmah Stima. So the Alter Rebbe Rashab asked a question, so it doesn't answer the question of the Mamutza. We still have the problem. You're saying that Keser comes to be connected between Ein Sof and Elamis. So now, question before that, Keser was either Ein Sof or not. Now we know Keser divides into two. So the question just carries over to Keser itself. How does Atik and Arich communicate with each other? If Atik is always Ein Sof, and Arich is always Reisha Netzolim, so how did you answer the question? You just carried it over to Keser. So the Rebbe Rashab answers that the real Chiddush is not Atik and Arich alone, but Chochmah Stima. That there's a Chochmah Stima both in Atik and Arich, and so to speak, travels from one to the next. In other words, there's a level that has both Ein Sof and creation and existence in it. So not just Atik is Ein Sof and Arich is Reish Netzolim. Chochmas Tema has an element of Atik in it, and also has an element of Arich in it. And he explains there's two levels of Chochmas Tema. Now, they both call Chochmas Tema two levels. One, he says, is Tema only Lefi Erech Hagili. In other words, it's only concealed because you can't see it. But it doesn't mean it's Be'etzem, not accessible. It would be just like I told you that behind in the closet, there's locked a treasure. So you can't see it, but it's there, and if you open the door, you can see it. Or things like, let's say, Koi ina shadaita deraba, adar boin shnin, Koi ina shadaita. So when you learn something, your teacher teaches you something. So it's true, there are a lot of things that you won't recognize until you're 40 years old or 40 years later. But that doesn't mean it's be'etzem behelim. It just means it takes time, your maturity and time, to ultimately recognize it. But it's there. So that's called sasum, not be'etzem, sasum lefierach hagili. Then there's a level, a little like helim sheyeshnu b'mitzias that I described before. It's helim, but you can access it ultimately. Then there's a sasum be'etzem, that you can never access it. It will always remain beyond our ability to reach. And that's the deeper chochmas tema of Atik. And the same chochmas tema has both dimensions to it. So in essence, to put it in simple terms, when chochma is recognizing the emes of Keser, it's recognizing two levels. One is recognizing something that it can't access right now, but with time, like he says in Likutei Torah and Veschanon, he says, what today is Amunah, tomorrow can be understood, and then Amunah is on a higher level. But then there are things that you always will know that les machshava tfisa beklal, that the Eibishter is always going to be beyond Seichel. And Seichel itself, Chachma itself, can also understand that. So it's really relating to the Eibishter, first of all, the things we can relate to. That's Mamish Chachma Gluya. There's things we can't relate to now, and it's Lamaila Mufla Memcha. And then there's a level that remains always Be'etzem Mechusa, Be'etzem Sosu. So I'm just going to give an example. I'll take a sikha from the Rebbe where he explains. This is from Tainus Esther Tovshim Memches. It's a Mugadik Sikha in Sefer HaSichas Memches. It's a Medidik Sikha where the Rebbe talks about, same, it was the week of Parshas Kisisa. So the Rebbe asks a few questions on the Psukim there. What does he say there? So Moshe says to the Eibishter, this is where Moshe was on Har Sinai asking for forgiveness, Mechila, Slicha Mechila for the Chet HaEgel, which will ultimately lead to Yom Kippur. So Moshe says to the Eibishter, Gilev Yud Gimel Midas HaRachmim, the whole Pasha Kisisa, very intimate conversation between Moshe and the Eibishter. So Moshe says to the Eibishter, Hareini noch es kveidecha, show me kveidecha, your glory, which is the Rambam explains, I want to see your face, not just your chitzenius. I want to see your pnimius. And the Eibishter says the famous line, Lo yoreini odam v'chai. No person can see me and live. And then he goes the next pasuk, he says, V're'isa asacheirai. I'll show you my back, upona lo yero, and my face I won't show you. So the Rebbe asked a series of questions. First of all, you already said Lo yoreini odam v'chai. Why does the Eibishter have to rub it in and say again, upona lo yero? Lisa Sachere, fine, I can't show you my face, I'll show you my back. Like Rashi says, the Kesher shall film, whatever. But why does he have to add again? Like to say, no, my face I will not show you. Second question. If Moshe asked something, and the Eibishter didn't grant him, why does the Torah have to tell us? Even Begnusha Shel Behema Tmei, the Torah doesn't tell us everything. Why do we have to know that Moshe asked, and the Eibishter said no? And finally, since Tzadi Geiza Kodesh Baruch Hu Mekayim, why take it? Moshe didn't understand that you can't see the Eibishter's face. He asked because he thought you could. Moshe was wise enough to understand that you can't see the face. So why taka was he not poiled by the Eibishter to see it? So the Gemara answers on Pone Le'yero. The Gemara says that the Eibishter tells the Moshe Rabbeinu, when I wanted to show you my face by the sneh, you covered your face. Now, when you want to see it, I'm not going to show it to you. So not this sikha, but another sikha, the Rebbe asked the question, what is this, a child's play? You know, it's like, when I want to show you, you don't want to look. Now you want to look, I'm not going to show you. What is this, the Eibishter playing tit for tat? Obviously, that sounds silly. So the Rebbe's answer is Meridik. The Rebbe says, the last pasuk where it says, you have to read like this. and the comma goes after a ponai. So I will show you my back. I will also show you my face, but my face you'll only be able to see by lo yiro, by not looking. So it's not saying my face you won't see. You could see. I will show them to you, but the back you could see by looking at it, and the face you have to look like b'derech yidiyas hashlila. You can't see it directly. So the Eibishter wasn't playing tit for tat. They were saying, when you wanted to see would have been on your terms. If you want to see me on my terms, no person can see me on my terms directly. It has to be through not looking. In other words, not looking doesn't mean a shlila that you're not looking. It means the only way to experience is by not being yourself. You have to go out of your own mitzias and have total bittul. So in a way, you have two levels of bittul here. One is a bittul to chochmas tema that you can relate to even though you don't see it. And another is a bittul to chochmas tema that you'll never see because the Eibishter is not us. At the end of the day, no matter how much we are besachar the Eibishter, we always have to know there's a shalei be'erach, a flaw that's going to be beyond us. So chochma ultimately can experience both things. The chochma leads us first to the first level of chochmas tema in arich, and ultimately chochmas tema in atik. Now, more on this is explained in Ayin Beis, as I said, in my modim of, I think the Shlach, I remember exactly, Ayin Daled, close to the end in the volume 1 in the earlier edition. Okay, we'll stop here, and I'll continue more about Chochmah next year. I think will be the last one before Pesach. Good day to everyone.